I waited until the phone rang, and when I answered, I was met with the one thing I never expected to hear. Your mother needs you. She's in the hospital. My name is Sarah Thompson. I'm 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family has always chosen my sister Emily over me. I'm not bitter about it, no. That would make me weak, wouldn't it? But when I look back, I can't help but wonder where things went wrong. I've always been the responsible one, the one who stayed close to home, who supported my parents through thick and thin. But it was Emily, younger by 2 years, who always seemed to get the attention. She was the one who was praised for her achievements, while I was left to pick up the pieces when things fell apart. I never complained, not out loud. I just kept going silently. But it hurt. It hurt when I saw my parents dote on her, when they would talk about how proud they were of her and how she had so much potential. Meanwhile, I was stuck in a routine, working at a local law firm, paying bills, making sure everything was running smoothly while they celebrated Emily's accomplishments. I was happy for her, of course, but why did it feel like I was invisible? It was on my birthday last year that I realized the extent of it. I threw a small dinner for my family, hoping they'd come, hoping they'd remember me. But as the hours ticked by, I sat there alone, waiting for a call or a knock on the door that never came. Emily? She was off on a spontaneous trip to Paris with her friends, posting pictures of herself having the time of her life. My parents? They were too busy to come. I tried not to let it bother me. It was just another sign of how they saw me, someone who would always be there, no matter what. But that night, I couldn't help but feel the sting of abandonment. I picked up my phone to check the time, only to see an empty text from my mom. Happy birthday, Sarah. Hope you have a good day. It felt like a punch to the gut. They never even called. That was when I started to wonder, why had I been invisible for so long? Why did they never see me for who I really was? The phone rang again, and this time, it was my dad. Sarah, he said, his voice sounding strained. I need you to come to the hospital. Your mom's not doing well. Just like that, everything changed. My heart raced as I grabbed my coat and headed out the door. It was only then that I realized I had always been the one who was left behind, but now, in a moment of crisis, they were finally asking for me. It didn't make sense. I didn't know if I should be relieved or furious. As I made my way to the hospital, I thought about everything that had led up to this moment. Maybe it was finally my turn to be the one they needed. Or maybe it was too little, too late. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and cold, a place where life and death were constantly in motion. I walked through the sterile hallways, my heart pounding louder than my footsteps. I had been here before, but it was never for something like this. The whole day felt surreal, like I was moving through someone else's life. I was still processing the phone call from my dad, the urgency in his voice, the slight crack that told me he was scared. I tried to steady my breath as I approached the room. The nurses barely looked up as I entered, too focused on their tasks to notice me. When I saw my mom lying there, I froze. She looked smaller than I remembered, frilier, like someone had taken all the energy out of her. Her once vibrant, sharp eyes were now dull, and her hands were tightly clenched in the sheets. I stood there for a moment, just watching her, trying to make sense of why I had come. Was this really my place to be here? The daughter who had been forgotten in favor of Emily, the perfect child? The daughter who had always been second best? My breath caught in my throat as I walked closer. It felt like I was walking in slow motion, as if the world had stopped turning for a brief moment. The machines beeped around me, their constant rhythm a reminder of the fragility of life. I was about to speak when I heard a faint cough from the doorway. I turned. To find my dad standing there, his face pale and weary, his eyes filled with something I couldn't place. It wasn't just worry, it was guilt, something deeper. She asked for you, he said softly, his voice cracking. I didn't know how to respond. For years, I had stood on the sidelines, waiting for my turn, waiting for them to realize I was there. And now, in the moment when I was needed, I wasn't sure I could forgive them for everything they had done. But I stepped forward anyway, taking her hand in mine. Her grip was weak, but there was a recognition in her eyes when she opened them. It wasn't a flood of emotion, no tears or grand gestures. It was simple. It was enough. I'm here, Mom, I whispered. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I wasn't second best anymore. In that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to step out from the shadows and claim my place in this family on my own terms. The hospital room felt too quiet as I sat beside my mother's bed. The beeping of the machines was almost deafening in the silence between us. I had always thought that I would never find myself in this position, that I would never have to face my family like this, with the weight of years of disappointment and frustration on my shoulders. But here I was, sitting beside a woman who had never fully seen me, who had always been too focused on Emily, too wrapped up in her own idea of what a perfect family was. My mother's eyes fluttered open again, and she blinked slowly, as if trying to bring the world back into focus. I held her hand a little tighter, and for a moment, everything felt like it was in slow motion. There was a long pause before she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, I'm sorry." Those words, simple and quiet, hit me harder than I ever expected. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times in my mind, but I never thought it would come with such simplicity, with such raw vulnerability. I wanted to say something, to tell her that everything was fine, that I was here because I wanted to be, not because I needed to prove something. But the words didn't come. Instead, I sat there, staring at her, feeling a rush of emotions I wasn't prepared for. "It's okay, Mom," I finally said, my voice steady, though my heart felt heavy. I didn't know what was okay. I didn't know if I could just forgive everything so easily. The years of feeling like the second choice, the years of watching as my sister got everything while I was left behind, it wasn't something I could forget. But as I sat there, watching her struggle to hold on to her strength, I realized that maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about letting go of the anger, the hurt. Maybe it was about finding peace in the chaos of everything that had happened. My mother's eyes softened, and she squeezed my hand weakly. "I should have been there for you more, Sarah. I should have been more present." The truth was, hearing her say that was all I had ever needed to hear. It wasn't about her saying the right words or making up for lost time. It was about her acknowledging that she had made mistakes, that she had missed out on seeing me for who I was. For the first time, I felt like I was enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was all I needed to finally start healing. The days after that moment in the hospital passed slowly. Each one seemed to stretch longer than the last, filled with quiet conversations, the soft clinking of trays as the nurses came and went, and the steady hum of machines that I had come to associate with life and death. My mother's condition was stable, but it was clear that this was a turning point. For the first time in years, I wasn't just the daughter in the background. I was needed. But even with that recognition, the weight of everything that had come before still lingered. I found myself replaying the conversations, the moments where I had been overlooked, where I had been invisible. It was hard to shake the feeling that nothing had really changed. The bitterness that had been slowly building inside me over the years didn't disappear overnight. I wasn't ready to forgive Emily or my parents, not fully. But I couldn't deny the shift inside me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a choice. I could keep holding on to the anger, the resentment that had defined so much of my life, or I could let go. I wasn't sure what that would look like, but I knew one thing: I didn't want to keep living in the shadows. I didn't want to be the one who always accepted being second best. The phone rang late one evening, breaking the stillness. It was my father's voice on the other end, his tone filled with that same quiet guilt. "Sarah, your mom wants to talk to you," he said, his words almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure what kind of response he was going to get. I took a deep breath and stood up, walking toward the small hospital room. The soft light from the bedside lamp cast long shadows against the wall, and as I entered, I saw my mother lying there, waiting. She looked up at me, her face softer than I remembered. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "I don't want to be the one who holds you back anymore. I see you now. I see all of you." I stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The years of feeling overlooked, the years of never being good enough, all of it flooded back in an instant. But there was no anger left in me, not anymore. "I know, Mom," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the emotion rising inside me. "I know. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. But it was a start. A start towards something different. Something that didn't have to be defined by the past. I wasn't ready to forget everything, but I was ready to move forward. I was ready to take my place in this family on my own terms. The following days were quieter, though the tension between me and Emily still hung in the air. I could feel it, the unspoken words between us, the distance that had always been there but had never been so palpable. She didn't come to visit. In fact, she barely called. It was like nothing had changed, as if my presence in that hospital room hadn't made a difference. But for the first time, I didn't care. I was starting to realize that my peace didn't depend on anyone else. I could be strong on my own, without waiting for approval or validation. I went back to my apartment, the place I had lived in for years, but it no longer felt like the same place. It was as if the space had become a reflection of everything I had been carrying inside me. The weight of all the years of being overlooked, of feeling like I didn't belong. But now, standing in that small, quiet apartment, I could breathe. I was finally letting go of the past. I started picking up the pieces of my own life, things I had neglected, dreams I had put on hold. I signed up for a pottery class that had always interested me but that I had never made time for. I spent weekends hiking, something I used to do with my friends before life got too busy. I realized that in the midst of everything that had happened, I had lost sight of myself. But now, I was beginning to find her again. One evening, while I was making dinner, my phone rang. It was my dad. I hesitated before answering, unsure of what he wanted to say. "Sarah," he started, his voice softer than usual. "Your mom has asked me to reach out. She wants to make things right." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know how to feel. After everything, after years of feeling like I wasn't good enough, could I really let go of the past? Could I forgive them for everything? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us. It wasn't about forgiveness in that moment. It was about figuring out what I wanted, what I needed. "I'll think about it, Dad," I said finally, my voice calm. "But it has to be on my terms." I could hear the relief in his voice when he responded, "Of course. Take your time." And for the first time in my life, I realized that it was okay to take my time. To not rush into decisions just because I felt obligated. This was my life, and I was finally starting to live it for me. It had been a week since my conversation with my dad, and I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I had been thinking about what it meant to forgive, what it meant to let go of all the hurt and disappointment that had piled up over the years. But I wasn't sure if I was ready to take that step. I wasn't sure if I was ready to open myself up to the possibility of being hurt again. That night, as I sat on my couch, the phone rang again. I hesitated before answering. It was my mom. "Sarah," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it before. "Can we talk?" I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. Part of me wanted to hang up, to keep the distance that had kept me safe for so long. But another part of me, the part that had been waiting for this moment for years, wanted to listen. "Okay," I said finally, my voice steady. "What do you want to talk about?" There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear her taking a deep breath before she spoke. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've always chosen Emily, and I'm so sorry for that. I've taken you for granted, and I've never really seen you for who you are. But I want to change that. I want to be a better mother to you." Her words hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I had always wanted her to say this, wanted her to see me, but hearing it now felt different. It felt like too little, too late. But then again, maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when I could finally let go of the anger and start healing. I took a deep breath before responding. "Mom, I don't know if I can just forget everything. It's not that simple. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see if we can start fresh." There was a pause, and I could hear her exhale, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me a chance." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. A start toward something new. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding on to the past. I wasn't sure what the future would look like, but I was ready to face it. On my own terms. The next few weeks were a blur of small steps and tentative conversations. My mom And I started talking more, not just about the past, but about the future. I never expected to feel like this, to feel like there was a chance for us to rebuild something. I'd spent so many years harboring resentment, holding on to the belief that my family had abandoned me, that nothing could ever change. But here I was, sitting across from my mom at the kitchen table, having a quiet conversation. She told me about her regrets, how she wished she had been a better mother, and how she had been blinded by her own fears and insecurities. For the first time, I felt like she was truly seeing me not as a duty, not as a responsibility, but as her daughter. It was strange to feel like I was finally being acknowledged after so many years. But it wasn't perfect. There were still moments when I felt the old wounds, when I remembered how much I had been left behind, how my sister had always been the favorite. I still couldn't shake the feeling that Emily would always be the one who mattered most to them. But it didn't sting like it used to. It was more of a distant ache, something that no longer controlled me. One evening, as we sat together, my mom spoke again, this time more softly. "Sarah, I know this won't fix everything, but I want you to know that you're enough. You always have been. And I've been blind to that for so long." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, to accept the apology that I had longed for. Another part of me, the part that had spent so many years protecting myself from the hurt, wasn't sure if I could let go of the past. But in that moment, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting what had happened, acknowledging the pain, and choosing to move forward anyway. It was about choosing peace, not for them, but for me. As I sat there, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I was starting to feel whole again, starting to realize that I didn't need my family's approval to be enough. I didn't need them to validate my worth. I had spent too long letting their choices define me, but I was learning that my worth wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. I was enough, just as I was. As the weeks went by, I started to settle into this new version of myself. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was enough to make me realize that I didn't have to keep proving my worth to anyone. The need to be seen by my family, especially my parents, had always been a driving force in my life, but now it felt like I was finally free from that pressure. I spent more time doing things that brought me joy, taking long walks in the park, reading books I had put off for years, and even starting a small project at home that I had always wanted to do. Slowly, I started to see how much of my life had been on hold, waiting for approval, for validation. But now I could move forward on my own terms. One afternoon, Emily called. It was the first time I had heard from her in weeks. Her voice was uncertain when she spoke. "Sarah, I wanted to check in. How are you?" I was taken aback. It wasn't like her to reach out without something at stake. "I'm doing okay," I said, keeping my voice neutral. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About how I've treated you. I know I haven't been a good sister." I didn't know how to respond. I had spent so long resenting her, carrying the weight of the years when I felt invisible in her shadow. But hearing her say these words, hearing the sincerity in her voice, made me pause. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, my voice calm but guarded. "But it's not just about words. It's about actions." She seemed to understand the gravity of what I was saying. "I know," she said softly. "I want to do better. I don't want to keep hurting you." There was a sense of finality in her words, as if she, too, had realized that things couldn't go on the way they had. I didn't know if things would ever be the same between us. I didn't know if I could ever fully trust her again. But I was starting to realize that I didn't need her approval to move forward. I didn't need anyone's approval. As I hung up the phone, I felt a small weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. I didn't need to hold on to the hurt anymore. I didn't need to keep living in the past. The future was mine to shape, and I was finally starting to take control of it. The changes were subtle at first, like the gentle shift of a current that you only feel when you stop to pay attention. I noticed it in the way my mom now looked at me longer, softer, as if she was seeing me for the first time in years. There were no grand gestures, no over-the-top apologies, but there was something more real between us. Something that didn't need to be spoken. My dad, too, had started showing up more often, calling just to check in, asking how my day had gone, something he hadn't done in forever. It felt different, but not in a way that was forced. It felt like a slow rebuilding of something that had been cracked, something that had been shattered over time, but was still worth trying to fix. Emily had also started to reach out more, though it wasn't always easy. I could tell she was struggling, not with the apology, but with the fact that I had finally started to take control of my own life. The power dynamics between us, which had always been skewed, were slowly starting to shift. I could feel it in the way she hesitated when she spoke, in the way her words no longer had the same weight they once did. For the first time, I was no longer seeking her approval. And while she didn't always know how to handle it, I could see that it was slowly making her realize something. She wasn't used to not having me in her shadow. It wasn't easy, of course. There were moments when the old patterns tried to slip back in. When the insecurities and the familiar feelings of inadequacy crept up, trying to pull me back into a place where I didn't feel good enough. But those moments became fewer, and the time I spent in that space grew shorter. I wasn't letting myself slip back into that person. And that was a revelation in itself, seeing how much I had been holding on to, how much I had been keeping inside because I thought it was the only way to be loved, to be accepted. But that wasn't true. I didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. I didn't need to hold on to the idea that I wasn't enough. I was enough. And as I started to believe that, everything else started to fall into place. I felt like I was finally living my life, not for anyone else, but for me. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free. The weeks continued to move by, but something had fundamentally shifted in me. I was no longer waiting for a call, no longer hoping that my family would come around, that they would finally see me for who I was. I had stopped seeking their approval, and in doing so, I felt lighter. My life was no longer defined by their expectations, by the weight of their choices, or the silence that had always been there between us. I had started to build my own world, piece by piece. I had reconnected with old friends, those who had seen me not for my family role, but for who I truly was. We met at cafes, went on weekend trips, shared laughs and stories that didn't revolve around the things I had been running from. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was truly living for myself. Work became something I enjoyed again. I was no longer trying to prove anything, and as a result, I was more confident, more capable than I had been in years. The pressure I had once felt to fit into a mold that wasn't mine had disappeared. It was like the weight of my past had finally lifted, leaving room for me to breathe. Emily reached out again, this time in a more genuine way. She called me one afternoon, and her voice was softer, more open. "Sarah," she said, "I know things have been hard between us. And I don't expect everything to change overnight. But I want to try. I want us to have a real relationship, not just one built on old expectations and resentments." I wasn't sure how to respond at first. It was so different from the usual exchanges we had, the ones filled with passive aggression and competition. But there was something in her voice that made me pause. She wasn't asking for forgiveness right away. She was asking for a chance to rebuild what we had lost. "I'm willing to try," I said quietly, though a part of me was still unsure. "But it won't be easy." And it wasn't. Rebuilding a relationship after also started to understand me in a way they hadn't before. Our conversations were no longer filled with guilt or expectation. There was no more unspoken pressure to conform to some idealized version of family. It was simple, real, and in its own way, healing. They still had their flaws, but so did I. And that was okay. We were all just trying our best. I realized that I didn't need to be angry anymore. I didn't need to fight for my place in this family. My place was already there. I had always belonged. The difference now was that I had found the strength to claim that place for myself. And in doing so, I finally understood something profound. I didn't need their approval to be enough. I was enough all on my own. The changes that had started so quietly, so slowly, were now becoming more visible in my life. I no longer felt the need to hold back or to second-guess myself. I had found a peace that had once felt impossible. It was a strange kind of freedom, one that came from within, from knowing who I was and not needing the approval of others to feel validated. I had spent so many years in the shadow of my family's expectations, but now I was walking in the light of my own choices, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. My relationship with Emily had transformed into something real, something honest. We still had our moments of tension, but they no longer felt like battles. We could talk, really talk, without the walls that had once divided us. I realized that we would never go back to the way things had been, and that was okay. We were learning how to be sisters in a new way, without the competition, without the unspoken rivalry. There was a gentleness in our conversations now, a mutual understanding that hadn't existed before. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. My parents, too, were beginning to show up in ways I had always longed for. They were trying, and that effort, though imperfect, meant more to me than I had ever realized. The conversations were still awkward at times, but there was no longer that painful undercurrent of guilt that used to hang in the air whenever we spoke. We had started to rebuild, not just as a family, but as individuals, each of us trying to find our own way, our own space in the world. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was progress. I had realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing the past. It was about accepting what had happened and choosing to move forward to heal. And that was what I was doing. I was healing. It wasn't an overnight transformation, and it wasn't a clean break from the past. But as I looked at the life I was building, I saw a future that was entirely my own. I was no longer waiting for others to give me permission to live the life I wanted. I was living it. For the first time, I was truly living for myself.